Hey there, I'm glad you're here. Wherever you're listening from tonight, let's just slow things down for a moment. Before we begin our journey into the world of the Celts, if you find peace in these stories, please consider subscribing to join our community. It helps this new channel grow, and I truly appreciate it. Now, find a comfortable spot. Before history learned how to write, it learned how to remember. Tonight, we'll drift back to a world where gods walked like neighbours, where time bent in the mist, and stories were trusted more than ink. Take a deep breath. Let the day fade into the background. Close your eyes, and let the story begin. Long before ink dried on parchment, long before names were nailed into place by kings and chroniclers, the world of the Celts lay beneath a softer kind of sky. Not softer in weather. No, the rains were hard and the wind could come like a blade, but softer in certainty. The edges of things were not so sharply drawn. The horizon did not feel like a border. It felt like a question. Imagine the forests of ancient Europe when they were still thick enough to swallow sound. Trees crowded together in slow generations, their roots knitting the soil into a single living body. Mist drifted among the trunks as if it belonged there, as if it had always known the pathways. In the early hours, before the sun found the courage to burn it away, the fog made every clearing look like a doorway. A traveller could step between branches and feel, for a moment, that the world had shifted its weight, like a dream turning over in sleep. In such a place, the past was not something kept in books, it was kept in breath. There was a time when writing was rare or absent or simply not trusted for what mattered most. A mark on a surface could be stolen, it could be changed, it could be misread, but a story carried by the voice, held in the memory and passed from person to person, was alive. It could respond. It could warn you when you drifted too far from its meaning, and it could be shaped to the moment without breaking the truth at its heart. For the Celtic world, memory was not a lesser form of history. It was history's first home. So the stories moved through long halls lit by fire, through circular gatherings in the open air, through the hush of sacred groves. They moved along rivers and over hills, crossing from one tribe to another like migrating birds. And because they travelled this way, because they lived inside human beings, their tone was never fixed. Sometimes they arrived as myth, sometimes as genealogy, sometimes as prophecy, but always they arrived as something that asked to be listened to slowly. The keepers of these stories were not only the old, or the clever, or the loud. They were trained, they were chosen. They were shaped by tradition the way stone is shaped by water, over time, patiently, with quiet persistence. The Druids were among them, figures who stood at the crossroads of learning and ritual, law and philosophy, the sacred and the everyday. To call them priests is too narrow, and to call them magicians is too easy. The old world did not divide knowledge into neat rooms. A druid might be healer and judge, astronomer and poet, keeper of seasonal rites and keeper of tribal memory. Their authority was not only in what they knew, but in what they remembered, and in the discipline it took to hold so much of the world inside the mind. Then there were the bards, whose craft was the voice itself. The bard's gift was not merely to entertain. A bard could praise a king into greatness or shame him into ruin. A bard could keep a family's name from vanishing. A bard could lay a story into the hearts of children who would carry it long after the fire had gone cold. In a world where memory carried truth, the bard was not simply a singer. The bard was a bridge between generations, and because of them, because of that living chain of speech, the Celtic imagination grew into something both immense and intimate. Their world was never only what could be touched, it was also what could be sensed, what could be felt at the edge of sight, what could be heard in the pause between words. This is why Celtic mythology often feels dreamlike when we meet it now. It does not arrive as a single polished book with one voice and one purpose. It arrives like fog itself, shifting, thinning, gathering again. It arrives as fragments, as overlapping versions, as stories that disagree in details but agree in atmosphere. It arrives as echoes. The Celtic world was wide, and it was never one empire speaking with one mouth. It was Ireland, where the land is green in a way that seems almost deliberate, as if the earth is always in the act of becoming. It was Britain, with its rolling hills and ancient stones, its long coastlines where the sea feels like an old presence watching patiently. It was Gaul, much of what is now France and beyond, where rivers cut through fertile valleys and forests once stretched in a vast, dark quilt across the continent. Across these places lived tribes with different names, different chiefs, different alliances and rivalries, yet they shared ways of seeing. They shared symbols. They shared reverence for the cycles of nature, for the sacredness of certain places, for the nearness of the unseen. Stories travelled between them, changing as they went, like a song picked up by different voices. A myth that began in one valley could be retold by another people and given new colours, yet still it would carry the same deep heartbeat underneath. And then, slowly, the world changed. Not all at once, not with a single ending. The Celtic myths did not die in one dramatic moment. They were not struck down like a tree. They were worn down like a path in the grass, gradually by footsteps moving in new directions. Writing came more firmly into the world. New powers rose. Rome expanded, pushing its roads across Gaul and Britain, bringing its own gods, its own order, its own hunger for record and rule. Later, Christianity arrived, with a different kind of sacred story, one written down, preserved in monasteries, copied carefully by candlelight, and in time the monks, often the only ones trained to write, became the ones who preserved what remained of the older tales. But preservation is never simple. When the old myths were finally written down in Ireland and Wales, it was not the Druids who held the pen. It was not the bards speaking in their own halls. It was Christian scribes, men shaped by a faith that did not quite know what to do with gods who walked like neighbours and spoke like kings. Some tales were softened, some were reinterpreted. Some gods became heroes. Some sacred beings became merely fair folk, pushed to the margins of belief. And many stories, perhaps most, were simply lost, vanished with the last person who carried them whole. That is why Celtic mythology survives the way a shoreline survives in the mind after a journey, not as a single, complete image, but as a series of impressions, a stone pillar in a field, a name lingering in a place, a song fragment caught in the wind, a tale told, differently in different counties, yet always with the same strange light in its eyes. And because so much was held in memory, these myths were never meant to be pinned down. They were meant to be moved through, like a forest at dusk. You do not measure a forest by counting trees. You feel it by walking beneath it, hearing how the air changes, noticing how your own thoughts become quieter. The Celts lived close to the rhythms of the world, the turning of seasons, the returning of herds, the rise and fall of light. It shaped their sense that reality had layers, that the visible world was only the surface of something deeper, that beyond the veil of ordinary life there was another realm, not far away, not unreachable, simply adjacent, like the next room in a dark house. And so their stories speak often of crossings, of journeys into mist, of doors that appear where no door should be, of time that does not behave as we expect, of beings who are divine yet painfully human, of heroes bound by fate and sacred vows, of love that carries both blessing and sorrow, all of it drifting, luminous and half hidden, because that is how it survived. not as a monument carved in stone, but as something breathed from one life into another. Tonight, we begin where they began, not with certainty, not with a timeline, but with a world listening in the dark. A world where the land itself felt alive, and where the oldest truths were not written down, but spoken softly, remembered carefully, and carried forward like a flame cupped in the hands. In the chapters ahead, we will move closer to the heart of the Celtic Mythic Age. We will walk through migrations and sacred arrivals, wars between shining gods and ancient darkness, and the slow turning from divinity to heroism. But for now, in this beginning hush, let the mist settle. Let the forest stand around us. Let the storyteller's voice find its pace. Before history, there were stories, and in the quiet places of the world there still are. To understand the stories of the Celts, one must first understand that there was never a single Celtic world, only many worlds touching one another at the edges. The Celts were not an empire carved into provinces and ruled from a distant centre. They did not speak with one voice, nor march beneath a single banner. They were a mosaic of tribes spread across a wide stretch of Europe, each shaped by its own land, its own rivers and hills, its own enemies and alliances. What bound them together was not political unity, but a shared way of seeing, an agreement, quiet and unspoken, about how the world itself was ordered. In Ireland, tribes settled among rolling plains and boglands, where water hid beneath the grass and the earth felt soft, almost listening. In Britain they lived among chalk hills, stone circles, and coasts where the sea pressed close to daily life. In Gaul, forests once stretched so far that travellers could walk for days beneath leaves without seeing the sky. Each place demanded its own customs, each shaped its people differently, and yet across all these regions the Celts recognised one another, not by uniformity but by rhythm. Their lives moved in cycles rather than lines. Time was not something that raced forward, leaving the past behind. It turned like a wheel. Seasons returned, stories returned, even the dead in some way returned, through memory, through dream, through the nearness of the otherworld. The year itself was marked not by months as we know them, but by moments of change. The darkening of the year, the light's return, the stirring of growth, the gathering of harvest. These were not merely practical markers for farming. They were sacred thresholds. To cross from one season into another was to step briefly between worlds. Nature was not a backdrop to Celtic life. It was an active presence. Hills were not just raised ground. They were old, aware, and sometimes inhabited by powers unseen. Rivers were not simply water moving, downhill. They were living pathways, often given names, often honoured with offerings. Trees were companions in time, growing far beyond a single human life, holding memory in their rings. Certain groves were left untouched, not because they were owned, but because they were respected. The Celts did not separate the sacred from the ordinary. The sacred ran through everything like an underground stream. A meal shared, a treaty sworn, a birth celebrated, a death mourned. Each carried weight beyond the immediate moment. Words themselves were believed to have power. A promise spoken aloud could shape a life. A curse, carefully formed, could follow a person like a shadow. Speech was not casual. It was creative. This belief in order did not mean the world was seen as safe or predictable. Quite the opposite. The universe, as the Celts understood it, was alive, and like all living things, it could be generous or dangerous, orderly or wild. Harmony existed, but it had to be maintained. Balance could be lost. That is where sacred numbers and sacred places entered the imagination. Certain numbers appeared again and again. quietly structuring stories and rituals. 3 was among the most powerful, not as a mathematical idea, but as a pattern. Things of importance often came in 3s, trials faced, gifts given, warnings spoken. 3 suggested completeness, movement, and transformation. It was the rhythm of beginning, middle, and end, but also of birth, life, and death, or land, sea, and sky. These were not rigid systems, but recurring gestures like familiar steps in a dance. Sacred places, too, followed this logic of meaning rather than ownership. A hilltop might be chosen not because it was easy to defend, but because it felt thin, because the air there seemed closer to something unseen. Wells and springs were often honoured, their waters believed to heal or to reveal. Islands held particular power, surrounded by water, suspended between worlds, and standing stones raised long before memory could explain them, marked points where the human and the mysterious brushed against one another. At the heart of this worldview was a sense that reality had layers, the world of everyday experience, fields, homes, roads, battles, was only one layer. Alongside it, interwoven and overlapping, was the otherworld. Not a distant heaven, and not a place of punishment, but a parallel realm. It could be reached through mounds in the earth, across water, through mist, or by accident at certain times of year when the boundaries thinned. It was a place of abundance and danger, beauty and sorrow, where time flowed differently, and beings of great power moved freely. Importantly, the otherworld was not always separate. It could intrude into ordinary life without warning. A stranger might arrive who was more than human. A feast might stretch far longer than expected. A journey meant to last a night might steal years. These were not moral lessons in the simple sense, they were reminders. The world is larger than you think. This belief shaped how the Celts understood fate. Fate was not an iron chain dragging everyone toward the same end. It was more like a current. One could swim with it, or against it, but it was always there. Choices mattered, but they existed within a larger pattern. A person's life was shaped by birth, by land, by family, by promises made and broken. To live well was not to escape fate, but to meet it with awareness and honour. Honour itself was not abstract. It was lived. It showed in hospitality offered to strangers, in loyalty to kin, in courage displayed when retreat would have been easier. A leader ruled not by divine right written into law, but by the recognition of their people, and that recognition could be withdrawn. Kingship, like everything else, was bound to balance. If the land failed, if injustice spread, it was sometimes believed the king had failed as well. All of this formed the quiet architecture beneath Celtic myth. When gods appear later in these stories, they do not arrive as distant, untouchable figures. They step into a world already shaped by cycles and thresholds. When heroes rise, they do so within a universe that listens carefully to vows and remembers every crossing between worlds. When tragedies unfold, they do not come from random cruelty, but from tensions between duty and desire, fate and choice. This chapter is not a story in itself, but a map drawn in soft lines. It shows us a world without straight edges, a world where land, time and spirit are woven together, a world where the unseen is not above or below, but beside, and it prepares us for what comes next, for the first arrivals, the shaping of Ireland, and the long memory of migration preserved not in stone or ink, but in myth. Because before the gods walk the land, and before heroes lift their weapons, there must first be a world ready to receive them. Before Ireland was a kingdom, before it carried crowns or carved boundaries, it was a land waiting to be named by those who walked upon it. In the old stories, the island does not begin as a possession. but as a presence, silent, watchful, and already alive. The people who came to it did not merely settle the land. They entered into relationship with it. The earliest arrivals in Irish myth come not as conquerors, but as wanderers. Partholon is remembered as the first leader to bring people to the island after a great clearing of the world, a time when Ireland lay empty beneath the sky. His arrival is described quietly, almost gently. He and his followers came across the sea and stepped onto a land that had no fields, no houses, no paths worn by human feet. They brought with them the beginnings of order, ploughing, brewing, building, small acts of shaping that left marks on the earth. The forests were still vast, the rivers still wild, but human presence had begun to take root. Yet, Partholon's people did not remain. Disease came, swift and merciless, and within a generation they were gone. The land swallowed their efforts as easily as it had received them. Fields returned to grass. Silence returned to the hills. In the telling of this tale, there is no bitterness, only the recognition that the land endures longer than any who attempt to claim it. Then came Nemed. If Partholon's story is one of first footsteps, Nemed's is one of endurance. He arrived with his people and faced a land that was beautiful but unforgiving. They cleared plains, raised forts, and began again the slow work of settlement. But unlike Partholon's people, Nemed's descendants did not fade quietly. They struggled. Their age is remembered as a time of hardship and resistance, shaped by conflict with the Fomorians, beings of chaos and oppression who rose from the edges of the world. Whether these figures are remembered as monstrous invaders or as personifications of storm, sea, and suffering, their presence marks a turning point. Life on the island was no longer only about survival against nature, but about survival against domination. Nemed's people were burdened, taxed, and driven into cycles of loss. Over time, their strength broke. Some fled, some were scattered, some were lost to memory. What remained was the sense that Ireland was not an easy land, and that to live upon it required resilience, unity, and respect for forces both seen and unseen. From this broken age arose the Firbolg. Their story carries the weight of return. The Firbolg are said to have descended from those who fled Ireland in the time of Nemed, driven into exile and hardship abroad. They laboured under oppression in distant lands, carrying earth in bags, an image that clings to them like a shadow. When they finally returned to Ireland, they came not in triumph, but with quiet determination. They divided the island into provinces, each with its own rhythm and authority. They established kingship not as absolute rule, but as responsibility, binding the ruler to the land and the people alike. Under the Firbolg, Ireland begins to feel less like an untouched wilderness and more like a homeland shaped by memory and return. Their reign is remembered as just, if not grand. They are not shining gods or legendary heroes. They are people marked by labour, survival, and the long echo of displacement. In that way, their story feels close to the human heart. It speaks of migration not as adventure but as necessity, of exile not as choice but as consequence, and of return as something earned through suffering. Taken together, these early arrivals form more than a sequence of rulers. They form a layered memory of movement. The myths do not tell us exactly when these events occurred, nor do they try. Instead, they preserve the emotional truth of migration, of arrival and loss, of settlement and struggle, of leaving and coming back changed. In a world without written history, myth became the vessel for remembering what it felt like to cross water, to clear land, to fail, and to try again. Ireland itself is never passive in these tales. The land responds. It offers abundance at times, resistance at others. It seems to test those who walk upon it, measuring not strength alone, but balance. Those who live in harmony with it are remembered gently. Those who seek to dominate it are broken, scattered, or forgotten. Hills and plains are named not just for geography, but for events, battles fought, promises made, lives ended. The landscape becomes a living archive, holding stories in its contours. This is why Irish myth often feels anchored to place. A hill is never just a hill. A plain is never only a stretch of grass. Each carries the memory of footsteps long vanished, of voices that once rose there in grief or celebration. To speak the name of a place is to awaken its story. These early chapters of myth prepare the ground for what is to come. They establish Ireland not as an abstract stage, but as a living world shaped by repeated human arrival. They show us a pattern that will repeat again and again, newcomers stepping into a land already heavy with meaning, bringing change, facing resistance, and leaving behind echoes. And they remind us that before gods descend in mist, before battles of cosmic scale are fought, there were ordinary people struggling to live, to belong, and to endure. The island remembers them, and in the stories that follow, we will see how that memory deepens, how the land itself becomes intertwined with divinity, and how the next arrivals will not come merely to settle Ireland, but to transform it forever. After the ages of wandering and return, after the quiet labour of the Fir Bolg had shaped Ireland into provinces and kingship, the island knew a different kind of arrival. It did not come with sails clearly seen on the horizon, nor with footsteps announced along the shore. It came with mist. The stories say that the Tuatha Dé Danann arrived as clouds rolling in from the edges of the world, thick enough to blur sky and land into one pale breath. Some say they descended from the air itself. Others say they came by sea and burned their ships behind them, so that retreat would be impossible. In every telling, their coming feels less like a migration and more like a revelation, sudden, unsettling, and luminous. They were called the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, though even that name carries uncertainty. Danu herself remains distant and shadowed, a presence more felt than described. What matters is not lineage, but quality. These were beings unlike those who had come before, not merely stronger, not simply wiser, but shaped by a different order of reality. They were not gods as later worlds would imagine gods, enthroned far above, issuing commands from unreachable heights. The Tuatha Dé Danann walked the land. They argued, they loved, they made mistakes, they knew loss. Their power did not separate them from the world, it bound them more deeply to it. When they encountered the Fir Bolg, there was conflict. The old stories speak of the first battle of Tuired, where the two peoples met in open struggle. Yet even here, the tone is not one of pure conquest. The Fir Bolg fought with courage and resolve. They were not cast as villains, and when they were defeated, they were not annihilated. They were given land in the west, allowed to remain part of Ireland's story. This too reveals something essential about the Tuatha Dé Danann. Their power did not require erasure. The world they shaped was layered, not wiped clean. Once established, the Tuatha Dé Danann did not rule Ireland like distant monarchs. They became part of its rhythm. They dwelled in hills and mounds, in lakes and hidden valleys. They were present at feasts and battles, at births and deaths. Sometimes they were seen clearly, sometimes only their influence was felt, luck shifting suddenly, time bending strangely, music heard where no musician stood. Their divinity was intimate. At the centre of their identity were the 4 sacred treasures they brought with them from 4 great cities of learning beyond Ireland's shores. These treasures were not mere weapons or objects of status. Each embodied a principle, a force that shaped the world. The first was the Spear of Lugh. It was said that once this spear was raised in battle, it could not be stopped. Victory followed it as inevitably as night follows dusk, yet it was not bloodthirsty. It did not hunger for chaos. It was precise, purposeful, a weapon that reflected Lugh himself. Lugh was not only a warrior, but a master of many skills, poet, craftsman, strategist, musician. His spear represented focused brilliance, the power that comes from balance rather than brute force. Then there was the sword of Nuada. Nuada was king among the Tuatha Dé Danann, chosen not simply for strength, but for fairness. His sword was said to leave no opponent alive once drawn, yet its deeper meaning lay elsewhere. Kingship among the Tuatha Dé Danann was bound to wholeness. When Nuada lost his arm in battle, he lost his right to rule, not because he was weak, but because the king was believed to embody the integrity of the land itself. A wounded king meant a wounded world. The sword, then, was not only an instrument of death, it was a symbol of responsibility. Power carried consequence. Authority demanded completeness. The third treasure was the cauldron of the Dagda. This was not a weapon at all, but a vessel. From it, no one ever left unsatisfied. It fed armies and households alike. It restored strength. It promised abundance. The Dagda himself was a figure of contradiction. Massive, rough, often mocked for his appearance, yet deeply wise. He was a god of life and death, of fertility and decay, of generosity that bordered on excess. His cauldron reflected a worldview where nourishment was sacred, where survival was not merely about endurance, but about shared sustenance. In a land shaped by feast and famine, this treasure spoke to a longing older than kingship, the desire that no one be left empty. The final treasure was the Lia Fail, the Stone of Destiny. Unlike the others, it did not move. It waited. Placed at Tara, the ancient seat of kingship, the stone was said to cry out when the rightful king stood upon it. It did not choose through force or lineage alone. It responded to harmony between ruler and land. Its voice was the voice of recognition. Together, these treasures formed a quiet philosophy. Victory without wisdom is hollow. Authority without integrity is fragile. Abundance without generosity is meaningless. And rule without harmony cannot endure. The Tuatha Dé Danann lived by these truths not perfectly but sincerely, and that sincerity is what makes them feel so close, even now. They quarrelled among themselves. They formed alliances and broke them. Love affairs sparked conflict. Jealousy brought ruin. Fate moved through their lives as surely as it would later move through the lives of heroes. They were powerful, but not immune to consequence. This is why their divinity feels human. They do not exist to be worshipped in the abstract. They exist to be encountered. A traveller might meet one disguised as a stranger. A woman at a well might be speaking to a goddess without knowing it. A king might receive counsel that saves his people, only to realize later that it came from the other world. And always there is the sense that they are not separate from the land. They are expressions of it. The hills where they dwell are not castles built upon nature, but folds within it. The mounds open and close like breathing. Music drifts out and draws mortals in. Time bends. What seems like a night of dancing becomes years of absence. When those who cross the threshold return, they are never quite the same. The Tuatha Dé Danann do not dominate Ireland. They belong to it. Yet even in their age of presence, change is already moving. The world does not stand still for gods any more than it does for humans. Other forces wait at the edges. Conflict stirs. Balance will be tested again. But for now, in this chapter of the long story, the island shines. It shines with beings who are neither distant nor perfect, with gods who walk beside rivers and argue at feasts, with treasures that carry meaning deeper than power, with a sense that the sacred is not above the world but woven into it. In the chapters to come, that brightness will be challenged. Darkness will rise, war will reshape the land, and the Tuatha Dé Danann will be forced to defend not only their rule, but their place in the order of things. Yet even when their age begins to fade, they will never truly leave. They will remain in the mist, in the hills, in the moments when the world feels thin. Because the Shining Ones were never meant to rule forever. They were meant to remind the world what divinity feels like when it's close enough to touch and close enough to break. Even in an age of shining gods and sacred order, the world did not rest in peace for long. Beyond the settled lands, beyond the known rhythms of harvest and kingship, there existed forces that did not seek harmony. They did not build, they did not cultivate. They arrived instead as disruption, as pressure against the edges of the world. In Celtic myth, these forces are remembered as the Fomorians. They were not a single people, nor easily defined. Sometimes they are described as giants, sometimes as sea raiders, sometimes as twisted beings born of storm, darkness and decay. Their shapes shift from story to story, as though they resist being pinned down. What remains constant is their role. The Fomorians represent chaos, the wild, destructive powers that challenge order not out of malice alone, but because that is their nature. They rise from the sea and from the shadows beyond the horizon. They bring blight to crops, imbalance to kingship, fear to the edges of settlement. They are the reminder that the world is not gentle by default, that harmony must be defended. For a time, the Tuatha Dé Danann lived beneath the shadow of the Fomorians. Tribute was demanded, oppression crept into the land, even gods could feel the weight of subjugation, and at the centre of this darkness stood Bela of the Evil Eye. Bela was not merely a leader, he was a presence. His single eye was said to carry destruction itself, an eye so powerful it had to be held shut by attendants, an eye whose gaze could wither armies and poison the land. When it opened, death followed. Bela's power was not subtle. It did not persuade or entice, it overwhelmed. Yet even Bela was bound by fate. A prophecy had spoken quietly, as prophecies often do, that he would be slain by his own grandson. To prevent this, Bela imprisoned his daughter, hoping to keep destiny locked away. But fate does not require permission. Through trickery and chance, through the kind of sideways paths myth loves, the prophecy found its way into being. The child born of that fate was Lugh. But before Lugh could rise, there was loss. In the first battle of Mag Tuired Nuada, king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, led his people against the Firbolg. It was there that he lost his arm, severed in combat. Though the Tuatha Dé Danann emerged victorious, the cost was heavy. For among them, kingship was bound to wholeness. A king marked by physical loss reflected imbalance in the land itself. Nuada stepped aside. In his place rose Bress, a figure of mixed heritage, born of a Tuatha Dé Danann mother and a Fomorian father. At first, this seemed like a bridge between worlds, a chance for peace, but Bress ruled without generosity. Hospitality faltered, tribute grew harsh, the land suffered, and with that suffering came the quiet understanding that Bress was not fit to rule. The Tuatha Dé Danann had gained power, but lost balance. It was then that healing came, not through war, but through craft. Nuada received as new arm forged of silver and shaped with magic and skill. It restored his body, but not immediately his kingship. The old rules were strict. The king must be whole, not just in function, but in truth. Eventually, the silver arm was replaced with one of flesh, fully restored. Nuada reclaimed his throne. Order returned, but the Fomorians did not retreat. They gathered their strength. The final conflict was approaching, and into this tension stepped Lugh. He did not arrive with thunder or proclamation. He arrived at the gates of Tara, the seat of power, asking simply to be let in. One by one, He was challenged. "What skill do you bring?" the gatekeepers asked. A smith was already present. So was a poet. So was a warrior, a harpist, a healer, a magician. To each challenge, Lu answered quietly, "I can do that too." It was not his strength alone that earned him entry. It was his completeness. Lug embodied what the Tuatha Dé Danann valued most, a harmony of skills, a balance of mind and body, wisdom and action. In him, the scattered virtues of the gods were drawn together. When the second battle of Tuired loomed, it was Lu who prepared the people, not only with weapons but with strategy. He asked each god what they could offer. He wove their strengths into a single design. The war that followed was not chaos meeting chaos. It was order standing against dissolution. The battlefield itself is remembered as a place where worlds collided. The Fomorians came like a storm breaking. Their forces were vast, their presence suffocating. Darkness pressed against the land. Crops failed. The sky itself seemed to recoil. Against them stood the Tuatha Dé Danann, wounded, wary, yet resolute. Nuada fell early in the fighting, struck down by Baelor himself. With his death, kingship passed not by ceremony, but by necessity. Lug stepped forward, not crowned, not proclaimed, but compelled by fate and moment. The clash between Lu and Baelor was inevitable. Grandfather and grandson faced one another across the field, prophecy humming between them like a drawn wire. Baelor's eye was lifted, its destructive power unleashed. But Lu did not meet it head-on. He did not match force with force. He used precision. With a single cast of his spear, some say a sling stone guided by skill and destiny, Lug struck Baelor's eye, driving its power back upon the Fomorians themselves. The gaze meant to destroy the world, instead unmade its source. When Baelor fell, the Fomorians broke. They retreated into the margins of the world, back into sea and shadow, back into the spaces where chaos waits rather than rules. The Tuatha Dé Danann did not pursue them endlessly. Victory was not about annihilation, it was about restoration. The second battle of Tuired ended not with celebration, but with exhaustion. The land was scarred, the gods were changed. Victory had been earned, but it had demanded sacrifice. This was not a tale of light effortlessly banishing darkness. It was a reminder that order must continually confront what seeks to unravel it. And yet, something profound had been proven. Power alone was not enough. Kingship required balance. Strength required wisdom. Fate could not be avoided, but it could be met with clarity. Lug's rise marked a turning point, not just in war, but in meaning. The age of brute dominance gave way to an age that valued integration, skill, and foresight. Still, the echoes of the Fomorians never fully vanished. Storms would always rise, crops would fail, darkness would return in new forms, but the myth offered reassurance. Chaos could be faced, not eradicated forever, but pushed back, reshaped, given limits. In the quiet after battle, the Tuatha Dé Danann stood upon a land that had survived another turning. They had defended not just territory, but a way of being. And though their age would one day fade, the pattern they set, the struggle between order and disruption, met not with despair but with resolve, would endure. Because even gods, the stories remind us, must fight to keep the world in balance. And balance, once earned, is never permanent. After the great wars had settled into memory, after victory had been claimed and order restored, the Tuatha Dé Danann did not retreat into silence. They remained woven into the world, not as distant rulers, but as presences moving quietly through its rhythms. To know them was not to worship from afar. It was to encounter forces that shaped life as it was lived. Birth and loss, creativity and destruction, courage and fear, abundance and absence. The Celtic gods were never meant to stand still. They were not carved into unchanging forms or locked into single meanings. They flowed, shifted, and revealed themselves differently depending on where one stood and when one listened. To speak of them is not to list names, but to enter a conversation about fate itself, about what it means to live within a world that is alive and attentive. Among them walked the Dagda. He was not beautiful in the way later gods would be imagined. He was large, heavy, often described with humour that bordered on ridicule. His clothing was plain, his appetite was immense, and yet beneath that rough exterior lived one of the deepest powers in the Celtic world. The Dagda carried a club so large it could kill with one end and restore life with the other. In this single object, the Celts placed a profound truth. Life and death were not enemies. They were movements of the same force, turning endlessly into one another. To fear death absolutely was to misunderstand life. To deny decay was to deny growth. He also carried a harp that controlled the seasons. With its music, winter could be summoned or dismissed. Time itself seemed to listen when he played. And there was his cauldron, always full, never empty, feeding all who came without judgment. No one left the Dagda's table hungry, not because hunger never existed, but because generosity was sacred. The Dagda embodied abundance, but not comfort. His presence reminded the world that fullness and emptiness were both necessary, that laughter and grief often shared the same breath. He was a god who knew loss as well as provision, who moved freely between feasting and mourning. In him, fate was not cruel, it was honest. Where the Dagda represented the deep current of life's fullness, the Morrigan stood where that current broke into turbulence. She was a goddess of war, yes, but not of glory. She did not ride at the head of armies to claim honour. She moved at the edges of battlefields, where fear whispered and certainty failed. She appeared as a woman, a raven, a shadow slipping through smoke. Her voice could stir courage or unravel resolve. The Morrigan was prophecy given form. She did not command events. She revealed them. She showed warriors what awaited them, not to spare them, but to test them. To face fate knowingly was a different act than to stumble into it blindly. In this way, the Morrigan didn't strip heroes of choice, she sharpened it. She was deeply tied to the land itself, particularly to rivers and boundaries, places where one thing became another, life into death, peace into war, certainty into doubt. She did not delight in destruction, but she did not avert her gaze from it either. She knew that endings were as sacred as beginnings. When the Morrigan spoke, the wise listened, not because her words could change destiny, but because they clarified it. Fate, in the Celtic world, was not a tyrant. It was a truth moving slowly toward revelation. And then there was Brigid. Where the Morrigan stood amid blood and shadow, Brigid stood by hearth and forge. Her fire was not the consuming blaze of war, but the sustaining flame of home and craft. She was goddess of healing, of poetry, of smithing, the quiet arts that mend what has been broken and give shape to what has not yet existed. Brigid's fire burned in many forms, in the hearth, where families gathered and stories were passed on, in the forge, where raw metal became tool or weapon, in the mind of the poet, where language itself was transformed into something luminous and lasting. She was closely tied to spring, to the moment when the land stirs after long darkness. Wells were sacred to her, places of renewal and reflection. To visit a well was not simply to draw water, but to pause, to listen, to allow healing to begin its slow work. Brigid reminds us that fate is not only found in grand battles and final moments. It is found in daily acts of care, in words spoken with intention, in hands shaping something useful and true. Her presence softened the sharp edges of the world without denying their existence. Together, these gods reveal something essential about Celtic belief. They were not idols demanding obedience. They were forces inviting relationship. They did not erase human struggle. They mirrored it, magnified it, and gave it meaning. To encounter a god was to encounter an aspect of life itself, unavoidable, powerful, and deeply personal. The Celts did not believe that fate could be mastered. This is perhaps the most important distinction between their worldview and later ones. Fate was not something to be conquered through knowledge or prayer. It was something to be recognized. To live well was not to escape destiny, but to meet it with awareness, courage, and integrity. Signs mattered. Dreams mattered. Encounters mattered. But they did not remove choice. They illuminated the path ahead, sometimes mercifully, sometimes painfully. A prophecy did not force a hero's hand. It asked the hero who they would become. In this way, fate was not a straight line drawn in advance. It was a pattern that emerged through interaction. Land, lineage, promise, and moment all played their part. A vow spoken in haste could echo across generations. A kindness offered at the right moment could alter the shape of a life. The gods themselves were subject to this pattern. They did not stand outside fate, directing it like architects. They moved within it. They suffered loss. They made mistakes. They learned too late. Their immortality did not spare them from consequence. It only ensured that they would remember. This is why Celtic mythology feels so close. Even now, its gods do not promise escape from sorrow. They promise understanding. They do not offer certainty. They offer meaning. The universe they inhabit is not tidy, but it is coherent. Everything belongs. Even chaos has a place. Even endings serve beginnings. As time moved forward, these gods would slowly retreat from the center of the world's stories. They would be remembered less as rulers and more as echoes, but the truths they carried would remain embedded in the myth that followed. When heroes rise and fall, the Dagda's abundance and loss will shape their feasts and funerals. When battles loom, the Morrigan's shadow will hover at the edge of decision. When healing is needed, when poetry is spoken, when a fire is lit against the dark, Brigid's presence will still be felt. Because in the Celtic imagination, divinity was never distant. It lived in the turning of seasons, in the crossing of boundaries, in the quiet knowledge that fate is not an enemy, but a companion, sometimes stern, sometimes gentle, always honest. And as we move from gods toward heroes, from divine ages toward human ones, this understanding of fate will follow us. Not as a chain, but as a current, carrying every life toward its own unfolding end. For the Celts, death was never a wall, it was a threshold. Beyond the familiar fields and hearth fires, beyond the daily rhythm of breath and labour, there existed another realm, one that brushed against the mortal world so closely it could be entered by mistake. This was the Otherworld, not a distant heaven, not a place of judgment or punishment, but a parallel reality, woven alongside the visible one like a second melody beneath the first. It didn't belong only to the dead. The living crossed into it. The young wandered there. The brave were invited. And sometimes the unwary slipped across without knowing until it was too late to turn back. Among its many names, one returns again and again in Irish myth. Tír na Nog, the land of youth. It was not a land where time stood still. Time simply moved differently. There, age didn't press its weight upon the body. Sorrow didn't settle into bone. Laughter did not fade into memory. The land itself seemed forever caught in a moment of perfect becoming, neither beginning nor ending, but an endless present. Fields bloomed without decay, music drifted without source, feasts waited without preparation. Those who entered Tír na nÓg found themselves lightened, not only of years, but of regret. It was not that hardship had never existed there, it was that hardship had no hold. Yet this beauty carried a quiet danger, because while time flowed gently in the otherworld, it moved relentlessly in the human one. A day spent in Tír na nÓg might become years or centuries elsewhere. Those who returned often found their homes gone, their names forgotten, their world reshaped beyond recognition. And in many tales, the moment their foot touched mortal ground again, age rushed upon them all at once, claiming what had merely been delayed. These stories were not meant to frighten, they were meant to teach attentiveness. The otherworld was not a reward for goodness, nor a trap for the foolish. It was a realm of invitation and consequence. To enter it was to accept that not all gifts could be kept, and that not all beauty could be carried home. The paths between worlds were many and rarely obvious. A burial mound might open at dusk, a lake might reveal a shining island beneath its surface. A woman with otherworldly eyes might offer an apple, a branch, a song. A boat might arrive without oars, waiting silently at the shore. Journeys between worlds were not always heroic. Sometimes they were accidental. A hunter chasing a deer might cross into a glade where the air felt different. A wanderer resting by a well might hear music where no musician stood. In such moments, the world thinned and choice became delicate. What mattered was not strength, but awareness. Those who entered the otherworld often returned changed, not wounded, not broken, but altered. They carried knowledge that did not sit easily among ordinary lives. Some became poets, their words carrying a strange clarity. Some became restless, unable to settle again into fields and seasons, and some never returned at all, choosing the timelessness of the otherworld over the weight of memory. This closeness between realms shaped how the Celts understood death. Death was not exile, it was not annihilation. It was a passage into a state of being that remained connected to the living world. The dead were not gone, they were elsewhere. Ancestors lingered in dreams, in stories, in the hush of familiar places. Their presence was felt at certain times of year, especially when the boundary between worlds grew thin. At Samhain, when the year turned toward darkness, the dead were believed to walk again among the living. Fires were lit not to ward them off, but to welcome and guide them. Food was set aside. Doors were left unlatched. This was not fear, it was recognition. Life did not end, it changed rooms. This belief did not erase grief. Loss still cut deeply, but it softened despair. To mourn was not to say farewell forever, but to acknowledge separation within continuity. Love did not vanish at death, it shifted its form. The otherworld was also a place of testing. Not all who entered found comfort. Some encountered challenges that revealed hidden truths about themselves. Others were offered choices that exposed their deepest longings. In this way, the otherworld mirrored the mortal world, but without illusion. It showed things as they were, stripped of habit and expectation. And it was ruled not by kings on thrones, but by beings who embodied the land's deeper patterns, gods, queens, and shapeshifters whose authority came from alignment rather than force. They did not coerce, they invited. This is why death in Celtic myth feels less final and more mysterious. It is not the end of the story, it is the moment the story changes tone. Those who died in battle did not vanish into nothingness. They passed into another mode of existence, where honour and memory continued their work. Those who lived quietly were no less present after death. They too became part of the unseen landscape. The land itself held them. Hills were shaped by their footsteps. Rivers remembered their names. Stories carried their choices forward. To live with this understanding was to live carefully, not cautiously, but attentively. Every action echoed beyond its moment. Every promise mattered. Every life was part of a longer rhythm that did not end with the body. As we move toward the Age of Heroes, this belief will remain close. Warriors will face death without denial, knowing it is not a void. Lovers will risk loss, knowing love is not wasted. And the stories themselves will move freely between worlds, refusing to stay confined to one reality. Because in the Celtic, imagination, the veil between life and death, was never thick. It was mist, and mist, as the old stories remind us, can always be crossed, if one listens carefully enough to know when to step forward and when to turn back. There comes a moment in every long story when the voices change. The gods do not vanish, but they step back. Their footsteps grow softer, their presence moves to the edges of the tale. And into the space they leave, human lives begin to speak more loudly. This is the turning that marks the beginning of the heroic age. The world itself does not suddenly transform. The hills remain. The rivers keep their course. The Otherworld still lies close, its doors opening and closing with the seasons. But the focus shifts. The stories turn their gaze from shining beings who shape the land itself toward men and women who must live within that land, carrying both its blessings and its limits. Kingdoms begin to matter more than realms. Loyalty narrows from the cosmic to the communal. Where once the fate of the world hung in the balance, now the fate of a people, a household, or a single life takes center stage. This is not a lesser age. It is a more intimate one. The heroes who rise in these stories are not invincible. They bleed, they doubt, they struggle against fear and pride as much as against enemies. And though the gods still watch, still intervene, still whisper at crucial moments, the weight of choice falls more heavily upon human shoulders. Warrior culture grows from this weight. Honor becomes a guiding force, not as an abstract idea, but as a living code. A warrior's reputation is not owned. It is earned, witnessed, remembered. Courage is proven not only in battle, but in restraint. Hospitality is sacred. A guest must be protected even at great cost. An insult, spoken or implied, can ignite generations of conflict. Feasting halls replace divine courts. Here, deeds are recounted and songs are sung. Here, young warriors listen and learn what is expected of them. Here, the past is kept alive through praise and lament, shaping the future through example rather than command. At the heart of this culture lies a profound belief. A person is bound by their word. This belief takes its strongest form in the concept of gyasa, sacred obligations placed upon an individual. A gys is not a law written by a ruler, nor a command issued by a god. It is a binding condition of fate, often received at birth or early in life, sometimes through prophecy, sometimes through blessing. A gys might require a hero never to refuse food offered by a woman, or never to eat a certain kind of meat, or never to enter a place at a particular time. These rules often seem small, even arbitrary, but their power is absolute. To break a gys is not to commit a crime, it is to unravel oneself. Gyasa reflect the Celtic understanding that fate works through the ordinary. A hero does not fall only on the battlefield. A hero falls when conflicting obligations collide, when loyalty and desire pull in opposite directions, when the web of promises becomes impossible to navigate without sacrifice. In this way, the heroic age carries forward the old truths of the divine age, but places them into human hands. The gods once embodied forces beyond control. Now those forces live within choices, relationships, and moments of decision. The presence of the Otherworld does not fade, it simply becomes more selective. Heroes encounter it not as rulers, but as visitors. A warrior may receive a blessing or a warning from a being not quite of this world. A woman of the cedar may offer love that carries both wonder and doom. Time may still bend, destiny may still speak. But the responsibility to act belongs to the hero. This transition deepens the emotional tone of the stories. Loss feels sharper when it is human. Triumph feels heavier when it carries consequence. Glory is never clean. Victory leaves echoes. And even the greatest heroes are remembered not only for their strength, but for the moments when they faced impossible choices and acted anyway. The Age of Warriors is not an abandonment of myth. It is its refinement. The vast cosmic struggles of gods against chaos narrow into the lived experience of honor tested, vows broken, and fate revealed through action. The same currents move beneath the surface, but now they pass through individual lives, making every choice resonate. As we move forward, the names will change, the scale will contract, but the meaning will deepen. Because in the heroic age, the stories ask a different question. Not how is the world shaped, but how should one live within it? And in answering that question, the heroes of Celtic myth will carve their names into memory, not as rulers of fate, but as witnesses to its power. In the heroic age, when the gods had begun to recede and human lives carried the weight of legend, there was one name the stories returned to again and again, spoken with awe and quiet sorrow. Cú Chulainn. He was not born into obscurity nor into peace. From the beginning, prophecy gathered around him like a tightening circle. His life would be bright, his life would be brief, and the deeds he would leave behind would outgrow the man himself. He was born as Setanta, a child of unusual stillness and intensity. Some tales say his father was the god La himself, others name a mortal king, but even these contradictions feel appropriate. Cú Chulainn belonged to both worlds. From infancy, he carried a presence that unsettled those around him, not menace, but inevitability. He listened more than he spoke. He watched. The name by which he would be remembered came early, and it came through accident. As a boy, Setanta travelled to the house of the smith Chulainn. Arriving late, he encountered Chulainn's fierce guard dog, a hound bred to defend, to kill, to allow no stranger passage. The boy did not flee. He faced the animal, and in the struggle that followed, he killed it. Chulainn mourned the loss of his hound, knowing no creature could replace it. And so the boy spoke, not with pride, but with responsibility. He would take the hound's place. He would guard Chulainn's home until a new protector could be raised. From that moment, he was called Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Chulainn. It was a name that bound him to duty, to vigilance, to sacrifice, and it was a name that would follow him into every story that came after. Even as a child, his gifts could not be hidden. He excelled at games meant for warriors grown. He carried weapons too large for his frame, but raw talent alone was never enough. To become what fate demanded, he would have to leave home. Across the sea, beyond the known lands, lived Scathach. She was not merely a warrior, nor simply a teacher. She was a threshold herself, a woman of the otherworld who trained heroes and tested destinies. To reach her was to cross into danger willingly. Many who sought her knowledge did not return. Cú Chulainn went anyway. Under Scathach's guidance, his body was forged into something precise and terrifying. She taught him mastery of weapons, speed beyond reason, balance in chaos. But more than this, she taught him control. Strength without restraint was useless. Skill without discipline led only to ruin. And yet, there was one aspect of Cú Chulainn that could not be fully tempered. In battle, something awakened within him, a transformation known as the warp spasm. When it came upon him, his body twisted beyond human shape. One eye sank deep into his head while the other bulged outward. Muscles knotted and swelled. Blood steamed on his skin. He became unrecognizable, a force rather than a man. Friend and foe alike learned to fear this moment. For once the warp spasm took hold, there was no reasoning with him, no calling him back until the battle was done. This frenzy was not celebrated lightly. It was a curse as much as a weapon. It marked Cú Chulainn as someone who carried too much power for one body to hold, and it isolated him, even among those who admired him most. From Scathach, he returned to Ulster fully formed, not as a child, but not yet as a legend. That would come soon enough. The greatest test of his life arrived in the form of war. Queen Medb of Connaught gathered an army vast enough to darken the land. Her ambition was not born of necessity, but of pride. She sought to prove herself equal to any king, to any man, and so she marched, against Ulster, her forces rolling forward like an unstoppable tide. But Ulster was cursed. Its warriors lay stricken, incapacitated by an ancient affliction that rendered them helpless in times of greatest need. One by one, they fell into weakness and pain, unable to rise. The halls were quiet, the defences empty. Only Cú Chulainn stood untouched. Too young to be bound by the curse, he became the sole shield between Ulster and destruction. What followed is remembered not as a single battle, but as a series of duels, one man standing against an army, challenging champions one by one. This was not strategy, it was necessity, and it was honour. Cú Chulainn met each opponent at the ford, the narrow crossing where armies could not overwhelm him at once. Day after day he fought. Night after night he returned wounded, exhausted yet unbroken. He fought warriors older, stronger, more experienced than himself. He fought former friends. He fought men who knew his reputation and men who underestimated him. And each time he prevailed, not because he was fearless, but because he refused to retreat. The land itself seemed to bear witness. Rivers ran red, fields were scarred, songs spread ahead of the army, carrying his name like a warning. Even Queen Medb, hardened and resolute, recognized the cost of pushing forward against a single defender bound by fate. And yet, fate pressed on. Among those sent to face him was Ferdia, his closest friend, trained alongside him under Scathach. Their duel lasted days, each knowing the other's strengths too well to end it quickly. They fought with skill, with sorrow, with restraint long abandoned by the wider war. When Cú Chulainn finally struck the fatal blow, he wept openly. Victory offered no comfort. By the time Ulster's warriors recovered and rose to join the battle, the damage had already been done. The land was changed. Cú Chulainn was changed. He had held the line. He had fulfilled the prophecy written into his bones. But fulfillment came at a cost no one else could carry. Cú Chulainn's story is not one of triumph without shadow. It is the story of a boy shaped into a weapon, a hero burdened by destiny, a man who stood alone because no one else could. He did not fight for glory. He fought because there was no one left. And in that lonely courage, the Celtic heroic ideal finds its sharpest, most haunting expression. The child of prophecy had become its instrument, and fate, patient as ever, was not finished with him yet. Every heroic life, no matter how bright it burns, carries within it the shape of its ending. For Cú Chulainn, that ending did not come suddenly. It came slowly, deliberately, like a tide that has turned but has not yet reached the shore. Long before his final battle, the signs were there. Prophecies whispered. Dreams grew heavy. The world around him began to feel narrower. as though paths once open were quietly closing. His strength had never failed him. What failed him, in the end, was the web of fate. Cú Chulainn lived bound by Giasa, sacred vows that shaped his life as surely as muscle and skill. One vow forbade him from eating the flesh of a dog, for he bore the name and duty of a hound. Another required him never to refuse food offered by a woman. For most of his life, these vows coexisted without conflict. Fate waited patiently. When the time came, it arranged them to collide. On the road to his final battle, Cú Chulainn was approached by an old woman, bent and weary, cooking meat by the roadside. She offered him food, an act of hospitality that could not be refused without breaking sacred law. When he saw what she offered, he understood immediately. It was dog meat. To refuse would break one guise. To accept would break the other. There was no clever path between them. Cú Chulainn chose to eat. He did not hesitate. He did not argue. He accepted the cost with the same resolve that had carried him through every battle. In that moment, something vital weakened within him. Not his courage, but the unseen protection that had always hovered just beyond his skin. Fate had been answered. From that point on, the world turned against him with quiet precision. His enemies gathered once more, sensing vulnerability like wolves scenting blood. Old grudges resurfaced. Weapons once familiar became unreliable. Even the land itself seemed less willing to support his steps. And still, Cú Chulainn did not retreat. He went to meet his death as he had met his life, standing. The final battle was not grand in numbers. It didn't shake the world the way earlier wars had. It was smaller, harsher, stripped of spectacle. His body was already worn, his strength diminished, yet his will remained unbroken. One by one, he faced his enemies, fighting with the remnants of the fire that had once terrified entire armies. Wounds accumulated, blood soaked into the earth. His vision blurred. But he did not fall. Knowing that his strength was finally failing, Cú Chulainn bound himself upright to a standing stone. If death was to take him, it would not take him kneeling. It would not take him fleeing. He would meet it on his feet, facing the world. So he tied himself there, spear still in hand, body failing but spirit unyielding. His enemies hesitated. From a distance he still looked alive, still dangerous, still watching. Ravens gathered, circling, but even they waited. It was only when one dared to land upon his shoulder that they understood the truth. Cú Chulainn was dead. He had died standing, bound to stone, refusing the final surrender gravity demands of all living things. Even in death he held the shape of defiance. There is no triumph in this ending, no release, only stillness. The stone remembers him. The land remembers him. The stories remember him. Cú Chulainn's death does not teach us how to avoid fate. It teaches us how to face it. He was not saved by his strength. He was not spared by his devotion. He was not rescued by the gods who had once guided his hand. And yet, he was not diminished. In the Celtic imagination, this is the highest form of heroism. Not survival at any cost, but integrity to the end. To meet fate without illusion. To stand when standing no longer changes the outcome but still matters. As the stories slow after his death, the world feels quieter. Something fierce has passed out of it. The heroic age does not end here, but it is altered. The fire that burned so intensely in one life now scatters into embers across many. Cú Chulainn does not fade into comfort. He becomes a measure, a reminder that greatness is not found in length of years, but in how one meets the unavoidable. That a life can be brief and still unbreakable. That even when the gods step back and fate closes its hand, there remains one final choice: to stand, and in standing to be remembered. After the death of Cú Chulainn, the stories do not end, they slow. The sharp edge of prophecy softens. The air feels less crowded with inevitability. The world does not become safer, but it becomes wider, allowing time to pass, wounds to settle, and lives to stretch beyond a single burning moment. Where the Ulster tales flare like lightning and vanish, the stories that follow move like a long road through familiar land. This is the Fenian cycle, and at its centre stands Fionn mac Cumhaill, not a hero forged in sudden brilliance, but one shaped gradually by time itself. He does not arrive as a storm. He arrives like a river, steady, patient, quietly powerful, carrying the world forward without announcing the force of its movement. Fionn's life begins in danger. His father, Cumhaill, once led the Fianna, the roaming band of warriors bound not by walls or crowns, but by loyalty and reputation. When Cumhaill fell, his enemies didn't rest. In a world where names carry weight, even a child can become a threat simply by growing into memory. So Fionn's earliest years are wrapped in concealment. He is taken away from feasting halls and bright banners, raised instead in the wilderness by those who understand silence as well as survival. In forests and open ground, he learns to listen before he speaks. He watches how animals move without waste, how rivers choose their paths without hesitation, how patience often succeeds where force fails. The land becomes his first teacher. It teaches him that nothing stands alone, that every action leaves a trace, that endurance is not weakness, it is preparation. Unlike Cú Chulainn, whose destiny seized him early and fiercely, Fionn's fate waits. It shapes him slowly, as though knowing he must carry weight across many years. Wisdom comes to him not through battle, but through a moment small enough to be missed. A poet named Finnegas waited beside a sacred pool for years, seeking the salmon of knowledge said to contain the world's deepest understanding. When the salmon was finally caught, it was Fionn, still young, who was asked to cook it, warned never to taste even a piece. But when the hot flesh burned his thumb, instinct took over. He raised it to his mouth. In that simple reflex, something opened. Knowledge did not arrive as thunder. It settled like clarity. The world did not grow louder. It grew sharper, as though blurred edges had quietly come into focus. From that day on, it was said that when Fionn placed his thumb to his mouth, insight came. Not commands from above, but understanding rising gently from within. This moment reveals the spirit of the Fenian cycle. Greatness here is not seized, it is received, not through ferocity but through attentiveness. Fionn returns from hiding not demanding loyalty but earning it. Through judgment, restraint and quiet courage, he becomes leader of the Fianna. The Fianna were not a standing army housed in stone fortresses, they were a roaming brotherhood. Hunters, guardians, warriors, and poets, living between the wild and the settled world. They protected borders and roads, defended communities from raiders, and upheld justice where kings could not easily reach. But they were not only fighters. A warrior of the Fianna was expected to speak with dignity, to remember poetry, to carry culture as faithfully as weapons. Strength without wisdom was considered dangerous, like a blade swung in darkness. To join them required discipline, moving through forests without breaking branches, enduring hardship without complaint, holding story and memory even under pressure. For the Fianna, honour mattered more than survival. Hospitality mattered. Loyalty mattered. But loyalty was never meant to be blind. It was meant to be chosen, again and again. Fionn's leadership belongs to this world. He does not seek battle as spectacle. He seeks balance. He understands that victory leaves echoes and that humiliation breeds future enemies. His task is not simply to win, but to preserve the conditions in which life can continue. And yet, the Fenian world is not gentle. It carries jealousy, sorrow, and regret. Its tragedies unfold slowly, not as sudden catastrophes, but as consequences that linger. Fionn himself is not flawless, sometimes wise, sometimes wounded by pride or emotion. His humanity is not a flaw, it is the point. Because the Fenian cycle is not about burning brightly and falling, it is about living with what remains. Where Cú Chulainn's life ends in a single unyielding stand, Fionn's story stretches across years. Friendships endure, love complicates loyalty, memory grows heavier with time. The questions shift from how to face death to how to live with the knowledge of it. The world now feels less like a blaze and more like a fire that must be tended, and in that quieter light, heroism changes shape. It becomes steadier, more intimate, less spectacular, but more enduring. So when we speak of Fionn mac Cumhaill, we're not only speaking of a hero, we're speaking of a turning, a movement away from the thunder of youth toward the weight of understanding, toward stories where love tests what war could not break, and tragedy arrives not as spectacle but as consequence. For now, let Fionn stand as he often does in the tales, not shouting, not rushing, a figure at the edge of the forest, listening. A man who learned early that the world does not always reward strength, but it does sometimes yield to wisdom. As the stories of the Fenian cycle continue, the sound of clashing weapons grows softer, and another force steps into the centre of the tale. Love. Not love as comfort, and not love as rescue, but love as disruption. Love that tests loyalty, fractures certainty, and exposes the quiet vulnerabilities even the greatest heroes carry. In Celtic myth, love is never a simple reward. It is a power as binding as fate itself. No story carries this truth more clearly than that of Diarmuid and Gráinne. Diarmuid was one of the Fianna bound by oath to Fionn mac Cumhaill. He was admired not only for his skill, but for his beauty and gentleness of spirit. There was a mark upon his face said to be a love spot granted by the Otherworld that caused any woman who saw him to feel desire. Yet Diarmuid himself did not seek conquest. He was loyal, reserved, careful with the weight he carried. Gráinne was very different. She was young, proud, and fiercely alive to her own will, promised in marriage to Fionn, who was far older than she did not accept her fate quietly. At a feast meant to celebrate the union, surrounded by warriors and music, Gráinne's gaze fell upon Diarmuid. In that moment, the future shifted. Gráinne did not plead. She did not wait. She placed a gaze upon Diarmuid, a sacred command that bound him to act. She ordered him to flee with her, to choose love over loyalty, desire over oath. Diarmuid resisted. He knew what this would mean. To follow Gráinne was to betray Fionn, his leader and benefactor. To refuse was to break a gaze and unravel himself. Once again, fate closed its hands around a human life, offering no path without loss. He chose Gráinne. Their flight across Ireland is remembered not as romance alone, but as endurance. They didn't run through open fields untouched. They hid in forests, slept beneath the open sky, crossed rivers and mountains with Fionn's wrath close behind them. Each place they rested would later be named, remembered as a pause in their long exile. Though Gráinne's passion drove their escape, it was Diarmuid who bore its weight. He hunted for food, guarded their sleep, and constantly urged restraint. He refused to touch her for a long time, honouring the boundaries of loyalty even as he broke them. Love, in this telling, is not indulgence. It is tension, between what the heart demands and what honour forbids. Fionn pursued them relentlessly, not always with fury, and not always with cruelty, but with wounded pride and sorrow sharpened into resolve. Those who followed him felt the tragedy unfolding even as they participated in it. This was not a villain chasing innocence. It was a leader betrayed, a bond broken, a world losing its balance. Eventually time softened the edges of anger. Through mediation and exhaustion, a fragile peace was reached. Diarmuid and Gráinne were allowed to settle. They built a life together. Children were born. Seasons passed. For a moment it seemed the story had turned away from tragedy. But Celtic myth does not forget. Years later, Fionn and Diarmuid stood together again, not as enemies, but as uneasy allies. On a hunting expedition, Diarmuid was wounded by a great boar, an animal bound to him by ancient curse and prophecy. The wound was mortal. Fionn arrived while Diarmuid still lived. It was said that Fionn possessed the power to heal, to restore life by giving water from his hands. Once, twice. He gathered the water, and twice he let it slip through his fingers, hesitation battling compassion. On the third attempt, it was too late. Diarmuid died. Some tellings say Fionn intended to save him and failed. Others say resentment won in the final moment. The truth, like all human truth, is uncertain. What remains is the weight of regret. Gráinne's grief was unbound. She did not curse Fionn. She did not seek vengeance. Her sorrow was deeper than anger. It was the sorrow of a love that had already paid every price and still been denied mercy at the end. In some versions, she later reconciles with Fionn. In others, she never truly does. Either way, the wound remains. This story endures because it does not offer comfort. It does not declare love victorious. It does not condemn loyalty as empty. Instead, it reveals the cost of choosing between them. Diarmuid and Gráinne are not punished for loving each other. They are not rewarded either. They live briefly, fully, and then they lose. This is the human heart of Celtic myth. Heroes do not fall only in battle. They fall in moments of hesitation, in choices delayed too long, in love pursued at the wrong time or denied at the wrong moment. Tragedy arises not because the world is cruel, but because it is complex. Love binds as tightly as any oath. Loyalty can wound as deeply as betrayal, and regret often arrives after understanding. The Celts did not tell these stories to teach obedience. They told them to acknowledge reality. Life does not resolve cleanly. Even wisdom cannot untangle every knot. Some losses remain, not as lessons, but as scars. In these quieter tragedies, the myths move closer to us. They speak not of gods and monsters, but of people caught between duty and desire, between past and future. They honor love not by idealizing it, but by taking it seriously, by showing how deeply it can shape and break a life. As the heroic age continues to age, as its figures grow more human and less legendary, these stories prepare us for a final transformation. The world will soon change again. New beliefs will arrive. Old gods will fade into memory. But love, loss, and longing will remain. They always do. While the Irish stories drift south and west through memory and song, another current of myth moves eastward, across the sea into the hills and valleys of Wales. Here, the land folds inward, green slopes rising and falling like slow breath, rivers cutting deep paths through stone, mist lingering long after dawn. And here too stories took root, shaped by the same ancient sensibility, yet speaking in their own voice. These are the tales preserved in the Mabinogion. Like their Irish cousins, the Welsh myths do not arrive as a single unified narrative. They come as a collection of stories, bound together by atmosphere rather than chronology. They speak of kings and queens, of journeys into the otherworld, of enchantment and loss. and beneath their surface they echo familiar truths, that the world is layered, that fate moves quietly, and that crossing boundaries always carries a cost. At the heart of these tales stands Bran the Blessed. Bran is remembered as a giant among men, so large that no house could contain him. His presence reshaped the landscape simply by standing upon it. Rivers were crossed by his body, shores bent beneath his steps, yet for all his size, Bran is not portrayed as a brute. He is thoughtful, restrained, and deeply tied to the well-being of his people. When his sister Branwen is mistreated in marriage across the sea in Ireland, Bran does not rush blindly to war. He listens, he considers, and when he does act, it is with a heavy understanding that some wrongs cannot be undone without loss on all sides. The war that follows is devastating, is not remembered for heroics alone, but for its sorrow. Almost all who take part are destroyed. Victory, when it comes, feels hollow. Bran himself is mortally wounded, yet his story does not end with death in the way we expect. Before he dies, Bran gives instructions. His head, he says, must be cut off and carried back to Britain. As long as it remains, it will speak, offering counsel and comfort. Time will pass unnoticed. Joy will linger. Only when the head is finally buried, facing outward toward the sea, will Britain truly know peace and loss. This strange, haunting image reflects something deeply Celtic. Even in death, presence remains. Leadership does not vanish at the moment of dying. Memory continues to guide the living. Bran's head becomes a symbol of continuity, of the way wisdom outlasts the body, and of how endings are rarely absolute. Other Welsh tales move even more fluidly between worlds. In the Mabinogion, journeys into the otherworld are not rare events. They're woven into ordinary life. A hunt may lead across an unseen threshold. A feast may transform into an enchantment. A gift may carry a hidden condition that reveals itself only later. Like Tír na nOg, the Welsh otherworld is beautiful, seductive, and dangerous. It offers abundance, but it does not tolerate carelessness. Those who enter often return changed, carrying knowledge they didn't seek, or burdens they cannot set down. Time behaves strangely here as well. Days stretch, years collapse. What feels brief becomes long. What feels permanent fades quickly. These distortions are not tricks. They are reminders that human perception is limited and that the universe does not bend itself to our expectations. One of the most striking features of the Welsh myths is their tone. Where Irish tales often blaze with intensity, Welsh stories feel quieter, more dreamlike. Events unfold slowly. Dialogue carries weight. Silence matters. The emphasis is less on sudden violence and more on consequence. Words spoken carelessly echo across generations. Small choices ripple outward, shaping entire lives. And yet, the echoes between Irish and Welsh myth are unmistakable. Both worlds share a belief in sacred kingship bound to the land. Both imagine the otherworld as near and accessible. Both portray heroes and rulers as flawed, bound by fate rather than masters of it. And both understand tragedy not as punishment, but as the natural result of imbalance. These similarities are not coincidence. They arise from a shared cultural memory, a way of seeing the world that predates borders and survives division. Long before stories were written down in monasteries, before languages separated into distinct forms, these myths travelled freely, carried by voice and gesture, reshaped by each land they touched. In Wales, as in Ireland, the act of writing came late. The Mabinogion survives because medieval scribes chose to preserve it, even as the world around them changed. Like the Irish monks, they stood at a crossroads between old belief and new faith. And like their Irish counterparts, they did not destroy the ancient stories. They transformed them, softening edges, reshaping gods into heroes, allowing myth to slip quietly into legend. This transformation gives the Welsh myths their particular quality. They feel like memories already fading, even as they are being told. There's a sense of looking back, of knowing that something vast and luminous once stood here, and that only traces remain. But those traces are enough, because myth does not need completeness to endure. It needs resonance. The Welsh stories remind us that Celtic mythology was never confined to one island or one people. It was a web stretching across lands and languages, adapting without losing its core. And that core, the belief in a world alive with meaning layered, with unseen realities, and shaped by fate revealed through story, remains intact. As the centuries move forward, these myths will continue to change. They will be retold, reinterpreted, and sometimes misunderstood. But their quiet power will persist. In the next chapter, we will watch as another great change arrives, one that reshapes the spiritual landscape of the Celtic world itself. The old gods will begin to fade from the centre of the story, not through violence, but through transformation. And like Bran's speaking head, the myths will linger, still whispering, still watching, still waiting to be remembered. Change rarely arrives as a sudden storm. More often, it comes like dawn, quiet, gradual, almost unnoticed until the light is already spreading. This is how Christianity entered the Celtic world, not as a single moment of erasure, but as a long unfolding layered gently over what had come before. When the new faith arrived, it did not step into an empty land. It entered a world already rich with sacred places, seasonal rhythms, and stories that had shaped meaning for generations. Hills were still holy, wells still whispered, the otherworld still felt near, and the old gods, though no longer ruling openly, remained woven into the fabric of daily life. Christianity brought with it a different way of understanding the sacred. It carried written texts, fixed doctrines, and a single, universal narrative of creation and salvation. Its strength lay in clarity and structure, in words preserved exactly as they were first set down. For a world shaped by oral tradition and shifting myth, this was both a challenge and an invitation. The transition was not uniform. In some places, the new faith settled quickly. In others, it moved slowly, adapting itself to the landscape and customs it encountered. Old festivals were given new meanings. Sacred springs were rededicated. Saints took on attributes once associated with gods. The past was not rejected outright. It was reinterpreted. This is where the monks appear. They arrived not only as missionaries but as scholars. In monasteries scattered across Ireland and Britain, men trained in writing and theology began to record what had previously lived only in memory. They wrote down genealogies, poems, and long cycles of story, often with care, sometimes with hesitation. It is because of them that we still know these myths at all, and yet their role was complicated. The monks did not see the old gods as divine equals. To them, these beings belonged to a pre-Christian world that needed explanation, containment, and reinterpretation. So the Tuatha Dé Danann were no longer presented as gods ruling the land. They became ancient heroes, noble ancestors, or mysterious beings relegated to the margins of history. Divinity softened into legend. Gods who once shaped the seasons now lingered as figures of wonder and danger. They retreated into hills and mounds, becoming the Alsi, the fairy folk, still powerful, still respected, but no longer central. The otherworld did not vanish. It changed address. This shift did not feel like loss to everyone. For many, the stories simply changed tone. They became something told by the fire rather than something lived by ritual. They moved from sacred explanation to cultural memory. Children heard them as tales of bravery and sorrow. Poets preserved their music. Place names continued to speak quietly of what had once been believed. In this way, the old gods did not die. They aged. They became figures of the past, still present but no longer commanding the present. Their powers diminished, but their personalities endured. Their mistakes, loves and tragedies remained compelling because they reflected human experience more than distant perfection ever could. Christianity, for its part, absorbed what it could. Saints replaced gods at wells and springs. Holy days aligned with ancient festivals. Brigid herself transformed seamlessly, becoming Saint Brigid, her fire still burning, her associations with healing and poetry preserved under a new name. This was not coincidence, it was continuity. The Celtic world did not experience faith as replacement, it experienced it as layering. The old myths became the deep soil beneath new belief, and like all deep soil, they continued to influence what grew above them. There were tensions, of course. Some stories were altered to remove elements that conflicted with Christian teaching. Others were left unfinished or deliberately ambiguous. The wild edges of myth were smoothed. Chaos was given moral framing. Fate, once a neutral current, became something overseen by divine will. But even here, the old sensibility lingered. The Christian God of the Celtic lands often felt closer, more intimate, more entwined with nature than elsewhere. Saints wandered landscapes like heroes. Miracles occurred at thresholds. The sacred remained nearby. What faded was not wonder, but explanation. The world was no longer populated openly by gods walking among people. Instead, the supernatural moved into stories of saints, visions, and moral trials. The unseen did not disappear. It changed its voice. For the myths themselves, this transformation ensured survival. Had the old gods remained rigidly divine, they might have been erased entirely. By becoming heroes, ancestors, and legendary figures, they slipped through the narrowing doorway of belief. They became part of history rather than theology, and history, once written down, is harder to destroy. So the Tuatha Dé Danann lived on, as kings of the past, as fairy lords beneath the hills, as whispers in folklore. Cú Chulainn remained a hero. Fionn mac Cumhaill remained a leader. Their stories were no longer sacred truth, but they were not dismissed either. They were respected as memory. And memory in the Celtic world has always been sacred. This chapter marks a quiet turning. The Mythic Age does not end with fire or conquest. It fades, like mist lifting from a field. The shapes remain, but they are less distinct. The gods step back fully now, leaving the stage to history, legend, and eventually folklore. Yet something essential is preserved. The sense that the land remembers, that stories matter, that the past is not gone, only changed. As we move toward the final chapter, we will see how this fading completes itself, not with disappearance, but with softening. The druids will vanish, the oral chains will weaken, and the old stories will settle into quieter forms, but even in their quiet estate they will still breathe. The end of the Mythic Age did not arrive with a final battle, nor with a single story spoken for the last time. It arrived quietly. There was no moment when the druids gathered and declared their work finished. No ceremony marked the last night when the old gods were named as living powers. Instead, the world shifted slowly, almost gently, until one day the silence felt different. The druids were the first to fade. Once they had stood at the heart of Celtic life, keepers of law and memory, mediators between worlds, guardians of sacred knowledge passed from voice to voice. Their learning was never written down. It lived in the discipline of memory, in years of training, in long recitations carried carefully across generations. But a tradition that exists only in breath is fragile. As new beliefs took root and new systems of authority emerged, the space the Druids occupied began to narrow. Their roles were absorbed, replaced, or simply forgotten. Courts took over law, monasteries took over learning. The sacred moved indoors, away from groves and stones and open sky. No decree banished the Druids. They disappeared the way mist does, thinning, retreating, leaving behind a sense that something once stood here. With them went the certainty that stories were living forces. Oral tradition, once the spine of culture, weakened as writing spread. Memory no longer carried sole responsibility for truth. Words could now be fixed, preserved, copied, but also separated from the voices that once shaped them. Stories changed as a result. They grew shorter. They lost layers. They were told to children rather than entrusted to initiates. What had once explained the structure of the universe now explained the shape of a hill, the name of a lake, the strange feeling one had when walking alone at dusk. Myths softened into folklore. The gods did not vanish completely. They slipped sideways. The Tuatha Dé Danann became the fair folk, the hidden people beneath the hills. They were no longer creators of order, but guardians of old places. Powerful, yes, but smaller, closer, more easily offended. Their grandeur dimmed, but their danger remained. One still did not enter a mound carelessly. One still spoke respectfully of what could not be seen. Heroes lingered as echoes. Cú Chulainn was remembered as a figure of fierce courage, his warp spasm exaggerated, his tragedy simplified. Fionn Cumhaill became a giant of the landscape, shaping hills and lakes with casual gestures. Their stories were no longer lessons about fate. They were marvels, wonders, fireside tales, and yet, even softened, they endured. Folklore is not failure, it is survival. In folklore, stories adapt. They learn how to live in smaller spaces. They become flexible enough to pass unnoticed through changing worlds. They wait. The Mythic Age did not end because it was defeated. It ended because the world no longer needed it in the same way. The questions it answered about order, fate, and the closeness of the unseen were now asked differently. But the answers did not disappear. They were absorbed into habit, into language, into the way people understood land and time. A farmer still sensed something sacred in the turning of seasons. A traveller still felt unease near certain hills. A storyteller still lowered their voice when speaking of what might listen. The old stories became part of the background, like the hum beneath silence. This quiet ending carries its own dignity. There is no tragedy in it, only transition. The myths did not collapse. They settled. They accepted their new shape, and in doing so they ensured that something essential would remain. Not the names of every god, not the full breadth of every tale, but the feeling, the sense that the world is layered, that the past is close, that meaning is not always loud. As the Mythic Age recedes, it leaves behind a landscape shaped by memory rather than command, and in that landscape the final transformation prepares itself not into silence but into legacy. The stories are no longer spoken as truth, but they are not forgotten. They are waiting. When the last Druids faded from memory, when the old gods stepped fully into shadow, it might have seemed that the Celtic mythic world had finally come to rest. But myths do not end the way empires do. They leave no shattered capitals, no broken columns rising from the earth. They leave something quieter and far more enduring. They leave traces in imagination. They leave patterns in storytelling. They leave a way of seeing that survives long after belief has changed its language. Celtic mythology never truly died because it was never built to stand in one place. It was not anchored to temples or enforced by doctrine. It lived in motion, in voices, in journeys, in the shifting relationship between people and land. When one form of telling became impossible, another took its place. When gods could no longer walk openly among mortals, they learned how to whisper. Even now, in Ireland, Scotland and Wales, the old stories linger just beneath the surface of everyday life. They are felt in the names of places that refuse to explain themselves fully, in hills crowned with ancient mounds, in standing stones whose purpose is forgotten, yet whose presence still commands silence, in coastlines where the sea feels less like scenery and more like an old companion. Walk these landscapes long enough, and the myths begin to feel less like stories from the past and more like memories the land itself is holding. This endurance has less to do with belief than with temperament. Celtic mythology offered a vision of the world that accepted mystery without demanding resolution. It allowed contradictions to coexist. Gods could be flawed, heroes could fail, fate could be both inevitable and deeply personal. The universe was not tidy, but it was meaningful. That sensibility never vanished. It resurfaced centuries later in poetry and folklore, in ballads and ghost stories, in tales of the fair folk and the restless dead. It shaped how sorrow was spoken of, how love was mourned, how courage was imagined, and eventually it flowed into new forms of storytelling altogether. Much of modern fantasy carries a distinctly Celtic echo, not in names alone, but in atmosphere. The idea of hidden worlds existing alongside our own, of time bending, of journeys that change those who take them, of magic tied to land rather than conquest, of power that carries consequence, and heroes who are remembered as much for their losses as their victories. These are not borrowed decorations, they are inheritances. Writers and storytellers may not always name their source, but the influence remains. The forests that feel alive, the ancient beings who retreat rather than vanish, the sense that the past is not finished speaking. These are Celtic ideas, still breathing, still shaping imagination far beyond the places where they were first spoken aloud. And yet, the survival of these myths is not owed to books or adaptations alone. It lives in storytelling itself. Every time a story is told, for no other reason than to be shared, something of the old world returns. Every time a listener leans closer to hear about heroes bound by fate, about love that defies order, about lands that remember those who walk upon them, the ancient rhythm resumes. The Celts understood something fundamental. Stories do not belong to the teller. They belong to the moment between teller and listener. That is where meaning lives. That is where memory stays alive. This is why Celtic mythology feels intimate even now. It does not demand belief. It invites attention. It asks not to be proven, but to be experienced. Its power is not in instruction, but in recognition, in the quiet feeling that something in these stories already knows us. Perhaps that is why they endure so gently. They do not insist. They do not dominate. They wait. They wait in the pause between words, in the hush before sleep, in the moments when the world feels thin again and the modern surface briefly gives way to older shapes beneath. The Celts did not leave behind monuments meant to last forever. They left behind stories meant to move, to change form, to cross borders, to survive loss. Stories that could be carried when nothing else remained. And so they remain, in fantasy and folklore, in landscape and language, in the quiet sense that the world is larger than it appears, and that meaning often lives just out of sight. Empires leave ruins, myths leave echoes, and the Celts left stories that still breathe,